But then God also supplies needed to know information that the mind in its present state is inadequate to perform. Thus, the notion of religious faith and the notion of natural reason both fit into the scheme, into the hypothesis that there is a creator God. Another consequence of that hypothesis is that nothing in faith and reason can ever contradict. There cannot be, in principle, a single contradiction between anything that can be proved by the proper use of natural human reason and the things that are proposed for belief by God by divine revelation. If you find a single such contradiction, the hypothesis is refuted. That makes the biblical God very vulnerable to disproof. He's still around, though. I don't think, however, that he is sitting with bated breath waiting to see the cogency of my proofs tonight so that he knows whether he exists or not. What kind of proof am I talking about? Well, let's distinguish a number of different questions. First of all, whether God exists. A thing can exist without us knowing it. Secondly, whether we can know that God exists. A thing can be known without there being certain knowledge. Thirdly, whether that knowledge is certain. But a thing can be certain without you being able to prove to someone else that certainty. For instance, I am certain that I exist, but I don't think I can prove to you that I exist. You may disagree. I think Descartes failed. Fourth, you may be able to prove a thing with certainty, but the proof is not yet a scientific proof. The scientific method is probably the greatest invention in the entire history of science. It's like a skeleton key that enables us to make all the other discoveries. But not everything follows the scientific method. You cannot prove that your wife or husband loves you by the scientific method. You cannot prove that life has any meaning whatsoever by the scientific method. You cannot prove that beauty is better than ugliness by the scientific method. So I do not think that you can prove that there exists a God by the scientific method. Some people may disagree with that, but I do think you can prove that God exists by good logic. There's two extremes then. The rationalist extreme is to either prove everything about God or claim to prove God by the scientific method. I don't think that can be done. The irrationalist extreme is it doesn't matter, it feels nice, so I'm going to believe anyway. There are various kinds of proofs. There's a practical proof and a theoretical proof. A practical proof doesn't prove that God exists. It simply proves that it's practical to believe in him. The most famous of these is Pascal's wager. I'm going to give 7 proofs for the existence of God tonight. That's the first one. The second kind of proof is theoretical proof. Proof that proves that something is the case, whether it's practical or not. To quote William James once again, there's 2 kinds of people in the world, the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded put practice above theory. The tough-minded put theory above practice. The tender-minded think that happiness is the most important thing. The tough-minded think that truth is the most important thing. The tender-minded start with their own feelings. The tough-minded start with facts. It seems to me that good philosophers are all tough-minded. So I'm not going to give any tender-minded proof. However, some proofs are only probable and some are certain. I will give one probable proof. That might be a contradiction in terms, if you mean by a proof a certain demonstration. But the proof that's often called the argument from common consent, I think, is a very reasonable reason for believing in God, even though it doesn't prove that God exists. The other proofs, I believe, are certain. I know of at least 24, probably 4 dozen, proofs for the existence of God that claim to be certain. I think at least half of them are valid. I don't think, by the way, that Anselm's ontological argument is valid, but I do think that, well, the following 5 proofs are valid. Number 1, the argument from the first cause, or the contingency argument. Number 2, the design argument. Number 3, the moral argument. Number 4, the argument from desire. And number 5, the existential argument. The 5 proofs of Thomas Aquinas all fit under the first cause or contingency argument. But before we get to those 5 proofs, let me very briefly review arguments that are practical and arguments that are probable. Pascal's wager is my student's famous Well, their most popular proof. They like it the best. That proves nothing. They're in Massachusetts. But there are more philosophers, however, in Boston per capita than any other city on earth. The reason is philosophy is the love of wisdom, and wisdom comes from suffering. Somebody said to me, why do I wear this in New York? Do I have a death wish? And I say, no, I meet Yankee fans and we get along famously. I just say, we all know our place. I am the masochist, you are the sadist. There are certain things, like the law of non-contradiction, that are absolutely certain. Pascal's wager is an argument for skeptics, for those who don't think there's any good proof for or against the existence of God, so they wonder, since they have no tough-minded argument, whether there's a good tender-minded argument. And Pascal says there certainly is. It's a bet. What can you win? There's two things everybody wants, truth and happiness. According to the skeptic, you can't find the truth about God, no matter how hard you try. Well, let's calculate on happiness then. If there's a God, and if you believe in him, then you attain eternal happiness. That's a good bet. However, suppose there's no God. Well, then if you believe in him, it doesn't do you any harm. There's no payoff. There's no winning or losing after death. But if you don't believe in him, then, once again, if there is no God, it doesn't do you any harm. There is no life after death, no heaven or hell. But if there is a God, does it do you any harm? Well, suppose I say, I have here $1 million, and I'll give it to you for free if you come and take it from my hand. And if you don't trust me, you don't have $1 million. You've lost something that's enormously valuable for no reason at all. In other words, the only possible combination of winning is, number one, God in fact exists, and number two, I believe in him. The only possible way to lose is, number one, God exists, and number two, I refuse to believe in him. If God doesn't exist, then you don't either win or lose in the next life, when you will find out, and nobody can prove whether you're winning or losing in this life, if you're a skeptic and you don't think you can prove God exists or not. So, since the only possibility of winning is to believe in God, and the only possibility of losing is not to believe in God, belief is the world's best bet. Now, that's very crass and crude and selfish and has almost nothing to do with religious faith, except that it'll scare you away from atheism. And God, who is love, stoops to conquer. And he will accept even the most ridiculous of our attempts to come to him. Second, the argument from common consent. This is seldom given anymore, and I'm surprised at that, because in the past, when human consciousness and human society was hierarchical rather than egalitarian, it was a very popular proof. Whereas today, when almost everyone is egalitarian and suspicious of hierarchy, it's hardly ever given. The argument is, the vast majority of all human beings in all times, places, and cultures have believed in some sort of a God. Therefore, it is very likely to be true. Or to put it differently, in order to be an atheist, you must be a snob. You must believe that you stand among the very small minority who are liberated from mankind's most pervasive superstition. That doesn't prove anything, but at least it ought to make you worry a little bit. Now let me go into the 5 serious arguments for the existence of God. The first cause argument is, in one sense, very simple, and in another sense, very complicated.